May 1943. The heat of North Africa still shimmered like a punishment over the broken columns of the Afrika Korps. German officers, once immaculate in parade ground precision, now trudged through the dust under American escort. The desert had swallowed their pride as surely as it had their tanks. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Kruger, tall and severe despite exhaustion, refused to let defeat show in his bearing. To him, the fall of Tunisia was not proof of American superiority, but a failure of logistics and strategy. The German war machine remained in his mind, the pinnacle of human order, even if buried now beneath sand and humiliation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prisoners arrived at the Oran processing camp, a makeshift compound surrounded by barbed wire and American guards, whose easy manner irritated the captured Germans. Kruger sneered at the sight of the broad, heavy trucks and the crude American weapons slung carelessly over their shoulders. Everything about the enemy, from their posture to their machines, seemed graceless. Feldwebel Otto Reiner, his second-in-command, quietly took note of the American equipment, eyes narrowing in curiosity rather than contempt. Meanwhile, young Corporal Erwin Schulte, still pale and shaken from capture, tried to maintain composure. His admiration for Kruger mixed with growing unease. Major Hans Dietrich, the most senior prisoner, voiced what many thought. They win through quantity, not quality. A tide of machinery and men, built for mass, not mastery. His tone carried both disdain and denial. Kruger agreed, finding comfort in the familiar rhetoric. But Otto said nothing. His eyes lingered on a passing jeep, its engine still humming smoothly, despite the dust and heat. The Americans who oversaw the camp stood in stark contrast to their prisoners. Captain Robert Thompson, a calm and efficient officer, treated the Germans with measured professionalism. He was fascinated by their discipline, but unimpressed by their condescension. His subordinate, Sergeant Jack "Dusty" Miller, carried himself with a relaxed confidence that seemed almost reckless to Kruger. Miller laughed easily, spoke plainly, and didn't seem to care who outranked him, an attitude unthinkable in the German ranks. As the prisoners were processed, Kruger's gaze fell on the sidearm hanging from Miller's belt, a squat, ugly hunk of metal. "So this is what America calls a soldier's pistol," he muttered to Otto. "Crude, oversized, built for farmers, not fighting men." Otto gave a faint smile. "Perhaps, sir. But farmers do know a thing or two about making tools that last." Kruger ignored him. His pride was a fortress. Doubt could not enter yet. Later that afternoon, during a routine inspection, an American guard collected the Germans' confiscated sidearms for record-keeping. The prisoners watched. Their attention caught when one of the guards, Miller himself, pulled out his own Colt M1911. Its blocky frame gleamed dully in the sunlight. Plain, heavy, utilitarian, Kruger couldn't resist. "That is your sidearm?" he asked with a smirk. "It looks like something forged by a blacksmith, not an engineer." Laughter rippled through the German ranks. Dietrich clapped Kruger on the back. "A toy for children," he declared. "Our Lugers are instruments of precision. This is merely an iron club that spits bullets." Miller, unfazed, smiled and gave the pistol a lazy twirl. "Maybe so," he said. "But I'd bet my paycheck this old club still works after yours chokes on sand." The Germans scoffed. Kruger's eyes flashed. "You Americans always think strength replaces refinement. Power without discipline is just noise." Captain Thompson, passing nearby, caught the exchange and paused. He saw the mockery, but also the pride behind it, the kind of pride that blinded men to truth. He approached, hands behind his back. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "perhaps we can let facts speak louder than pride. Sergeant Miller, prepare a range demonstration tomorrow. Let our guests see what a blacksmith's pistol can do." The announcement spread through the camp like a spark. The Germans took it as a challenge, a chance to restore dignity. Kruger accepted immediately, his confidence swelling. Otto simply nodded, intrigued. Schulte, for his part, felt a nervous excitement. He had never seen a true American weapon tested. The Americans, meanwhile, regarded it as sport, an opportunity to humble arrogance with quiet proof. That night, as the desert cooled, Kruger and his comrades spoke at length about German excellence. "They know nothing of balance or precision," Kruger declared. "Tomorrow they will learn what it means to wield a real weapon." Otto listened but did not agree. He had seen too much dust in the desert to trust any mechanism that required perfection to function. The M1911's crude simplicity lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. Morning broke with a harsh wind sweeping through the Algerian camp. The prisoners gathered around the makeshift range near the wire fence, guarded but relaxed. The Americans had set up wooden targets at 20 and 40 yards. The air buzzed with anticipation, half contest, half theater. Captain Thompson stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, eyes cool and watchful. Kruger inspected the German pistols, 2 Lugers and a Walter, with ritual precision. The barrels were polished, the actions oiled, every mechanism tested. He handed one to Dietrich, another to Otto. "Remember," Kruger said, "this is about demonstrating superiority, not winning a game." Meanwhile, Miller cleaned his Colt M1911 with a rag, humming softly. "Ain't about showing off," he said to Thompson. "Just letting the dust do the talking." Thompson gave a faint smile. "Sometimes dust tells more truth than pride ever will." Otto approached the range first, glancing between the Lugers and the American pistol. He couldn't help admiring the simplicity of the M1911's design. No delicate tolerances, no ornate mechanics. Just purpose, raw and efficient. Kruger noticed his hesitation. "Focus, Otto," he said sharply. "Do not let their barbarism cloud your discipline." Around them, the Germans muttered predictions, confident in their engineering. The Americans lounged in amusement, ready to watch. Thompson raised his hand. "We begin with the German weapon." Kruger stepped forward, posture rigid, eyes narrow. He raised the Luger to firing stance. The first shots cracked through the morning air, clean, precise, clustered tightly on the target. The German prisoners erupted in applause. Pride flared bright and hot. Kruger lowered the pistol, triumphant, but the wind shifted and grains of sand began to dance across the range. Kruger raised the weapon again, confident, but as he fired, the slide caught. A misfire, then another. The mechanism jammed, delicate parts resisting the intrusion of dust. Kruger's expression hardened. He tried again, but the weapon refused to cooperate. Otto stepped forward quietly. "Sir, may I?" He examined the pistol, muttering under his breath about tolerances too fine for war. Kruger said nothing. For the first time, a shadow crossed his face, not of defeat but of doubt. The wind carried laughter from the American side, not cruel, but knowing. Thompson made a note on his clipboard. Miller stepped forward, tapping the slide of his pistol with easy confidence. "Your turn." "Sergeant," Thompson said, "the stage was set for revelation." The desert air shimmered with heat as the prisoners gathered around the makeshift shooting range. The day had grown harsh and windless, the sort of dry tension that made tempers short and eyes narrow. Captain Thompson stood under the shade of an awning, clipboard in hand, while Sergeant Miller and a few American guards set up the wooden silhouettes 50 yards away. A table held 2 pistols, the elegant narrow Luger P08 gleaming beside the darker, more rugged Colt M1911. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kruger straightened his tunic and stepped forward, the embodiment of German confidence. "We shall begin, yes?" he asked, glancing at Thompson with faint condescension. The American captain gestured for him to proceed. Kruger took the Luger in his gloved hand, the polished wood grip fitting as though it had been carved for him alone. "This," he said proudly, "is the product of true engineering. Balance, accuracy, and refinement." He loaded the magazine, pulled back the toggle, and raised the pistol with a marksman's poise. The first shots cracked through the silence, sharp, disciplined bursts. Each round struck near the bullseye. The German prisoners murmured in approval. Even the Americans nodded, impressed by the precision of the grouping. Kruger allowed himself a thin smile. "Precision is the mark of civilization," he said, lowering the weapon. Then, as he prepared for another round, a gust of wind kicked up from the desert. Fine sand swept across the range, stinging exposed faces and filling the air with grit. Kruger blinked against it, waited, then resumed. The next shot misfired. A dull click echoed instead of a bang. He frowned, cleared the chamber, tried again. And this time the toggle jammed halfway open. The silence from his fellow prisoners was thick. Kruger's face flushed red as he tried to work the mechanism. Otto Reiner stepped forward quietly, speaking low. "The tolerances are too tight. The sand has entered the chamber." He reached for the pistol, tapped the slide, and freed the mechanism with a practiced flick. Kruger forced a tight smile and resumed firing, but his rhythm was gone. Each new pull of the trigger felt heavier. When the last round discharged, he holstered the pistol with visible irritation. "A minor inconvenience," he muttered. Dietrich, standing behind him, scowled toward the Americans. "This proves nothing. A poorly maintained range." Miller smiled faintly. "Let's see how the toy handles the same conditions," he said, stepping forward. The wind had begun to die, leaving behind a shimmering haze of dust that coated every surface, including the weapons table. Kruger stepped aside, jaw locked tight. He wanted to believe that the failure had been circumstantial, but Otto's calm observation replayed in his mind. Tolerances too tight. That phrase gnawed at him. Thompson called for a short break, allowing everyone to drink from canteens. The Germans murmured in low tones, some trying to console Kruger, others pretending not to notice his unease. Schulte, standing near the edge, looked out at the horizon, at the empty expanse of desert that seemed to swallow arrogance whole. In that moment, Kruger's world of precision and order had shown its first crack. Sergeant Jack Dusty Miller stepped into the center of the range, the Colt M1911 dangling loosely at his side. The sun caught the deep matte of the metal, dull compared to the polished silver of the Luger. "All right," he said with a grin. "Let's see if this old gal still bites." He loaded a fresh magazine, slapped it home with a solid click, and pulled back the slide. The sound was heavy, mechanical, unrefined, and strangely satisfying. He took his stance, legs apart, the grip secure in his calloused hands. Without flourish, he began to fire. Each shot boomed, low and thunderous, compared to the Luger's sharp bark. The sand jumped beneath the bullet impacts, every round hitting the center of the target with brutal consistency. Miller's posture never wavered. He emptied the magazine, dropped it, slammed in another, and kept going. The M1911 spat fire and smoke, its frame rattling but never faltering. Then, deliberately, he stepped back, dropped the pistol into the sand, and let it sit there for several seconds. The German prisoners watched in disbelief. Miller picked it up, shook it once, chambered around, and fired again. No jam, no hesitation. "That," Miller said, holstering the weapon, "is why we call it a workhorse. Doesn't care what you throw at it. Long as you treat her simple, she'll treat you right." The Germans stood silent. Kruger's mouth twitched, searching for something to say but finding nothing. Otto folded his arms, eyes fixed on the weapon. "A tool built for the man," he murmured in German, "not for the engineer." Captain Thompson smiled faintly, stepping forward. "It's not beautiful," he said, addressing the group, "but war doesn't ask for beauty. It asks for what endures." His gaze lingered on Kruger, not mocking but steady, like a teacher waiting for recognition. Schulte's expression softened. The young corporal whispered, "It's ugly, but it works." Kruger's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to declare that efficiency without refinement was barbarism, but the memory of his jammed Luger silenced him. He replayed the moment over and over, the sound of the misfire like a bell tolling inside his mind. Dietrich, red-faced, stepped forward with a sneer. "A circus trick," he barked. "The American probably tampered with the sand. This is no demonstration of superiority, only deceit." Miller turned toward him with a good-natured shrug. "You're welcome to try it yourself, Major." Dietrich said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that even his fellow Germans began to shift uncomfortably. Finally, he turned away, muttering curses under his breath. Kruger stood rigid. Inside, something had shifted. The air felt heavier, as though the desert itself pressed against his pride. For the first time, he wondered whether German perfection might also be German weakness. When the prisoners were marched back to their quarters, Kruger lingered behind, glancing once more at the M1911 resting on the table. Its simple lines no longer seemed crude. They seemed honest. The barracks were quiet except for the low creak of the wooden beams and the distant hum of an American generator. The day's heat had given way to a cool wind that carried whispers through the open vents. Inside, clusters of German soldiers sat in dim light, talking in hushed voices about what they had seen. It was trickery, Dietrich declared from one corner, his tone brittle. The Americans used modified weapons. They wanted to humiliate us. Otto Reiner sat on his cot, arms folded, voice calm. Then why invite us to test it ourselves? No, Major, that pistol was as it is. Crude, yes, but reliable. Reliable, Dietrich spat. A blacksmith's tool. It has no refinement, no precision. Perhaps refinement is the enemy of reliability, Otto said softly. Kruger sat nearby, silent. His posture was rigid, but his eyes betrayed unrest. He had polished the Luger earlier out of habit, but each pass of the rag over the barrel had felt hollow. The weapon gleamed beautifully, yet he could not forget the moment it had failed him. Corporal Schulte, seated across from him, spoke hesitantly. Herr Oberleutnant, do you think maybe they build differently because they fight differently? Kruger looked up. The young man's question was naive but sincere. Differently? Yes, Schulte said. They fight with less pride, perhaps. More practicality. They build what they need, not what they want to admire. Kruger didn't answer. He stared at the pistol in his hand, his reflection warping across its metal. For years, he had believed that perfection defined superiority. But now, he began to sense that adaptability, endurance, was its own form of genius. Later that night, Otto approached quietly. Herr Oberleutnant, he said, I saw your expression today. You know the truth, even if you don't wish to speak it. Kruger's jaw tensed. You presume too much, Reiner. I presume nothing, Otto replied. I've worked with machines all my life. The Americans build theirs for men, not for museums. He paused, then added softly, and perhaps that is why they will win this war. Kruger turned away, the words striking deeper than he cared to admit. Long after lights out, he lay awake, staring into the darkness. The sound of distant waves crashing against the Algerian shore reached faintly through the wind. Somewhere an American guard laughed, a full, unguarded sound that carried ease instead of arrogance. It was a sound Kruger realized he had never heard among his own ranks. By morning, his decision was made. He would ask to see the pistol again, not out of pride, but out of need to understand. The camp feels different after the demonstration. Its air heavier, as though pride itself has been burned to ash by the gunpowder smoke still lingering in memory. Kruger cannot sleep. The rhythmic ticking of his thoughts drowns out even the chirp of desert insects. He replays the scene over and over, Miller's calm poise, the effortless recoil management, the punch of each bullet striking with perfect finality. That toy, as he once called it, had exposed a fault line in his beliefs. For the first time, he questions whether precision, elegance, and tradition are enough to win a war. The next morning, the Germans gather again in the yard, but there's no banter now. Dietrich fumes in silence, scribbling in his journal, muttering about American tricks. Otto sits quietly beside Kruger, cleaning a boot with uncharacteristic care. When Kruger finally speaks, his voice is low, not from weakness, but from weight. We laughed, he says, and now I wonder if we were the joke. Otto glances up, relieved to hear humility breaking through. He dares to agree carefully. Maybe we built for glory, Herr Oberleutnant. They built for survival. Thompson visits later that day. He offers polite conversation, but observes the changed atmosphere. He sees something working inside Kruger, the quiet erosion of arrogance, and decides not to push. Understanding doesn't come at gunpoint, he later tells Miller. Sometimes it just needs silence. Kruger, however, is not silent for long. That night he approaches Otto and asks for a favor. "Tell me, as a gunsmith, why did that American pistol never jam?" Otto explains the genius of simplicity: wide tolerances, fewer moving parts, and an understanding that perfection under duress isn't perfection at all. It's forgiveness built into design. This revelation shakes Kruger more than he expects. Forgiveness, a word foreign to the German military ethos. He recalls his father's lectures about flawless execution and absolute precision. Now he wonders, had they built weapons and ideologies too perfect to survive imperfection itself? By the end of Part 7, Kruger's pride is wounded, but not destroyed. It has become something new, questioning, searching. The emotional tone is introspective and somber. A slow unraveling of certainty prepares him for the next phase, the confrontation between truth and denial. The midday sun blazes mercilessly, reflecting off the camp's barbed wire and metal roofs. Heat waves shimmer like ghosts. Dietrich, standing in the yard, drills a small group of younger prisoners, Erwin among them, in strict formation, barking orders as if still commanding the Afrika Korps. Kruger watches from a distance, torn between pity and shame. The war is over for them, but Dietrich still fights shadows of the past. When Kruger finally approaches, tension thickens. Dietrich salutes mockingly. "Come to watch your men. Remember what discipline looks like, Oberleutnant," he sneers. Kruger's tone is measured. "Discipline won't save us from truth." Dietrich scoffs. "Truth? You sound like them now. Don't let captivity turn you into an American sympathizer." Their conversation grows sharper, cutting into the heart of the story's theme, the difference between pride and purpose. Kruger insists that acknowledging strength in others doesn't betray their own, it refines it. Dietrich sees only treason in humility. Their argument erupts in front of the others. Erwin watches, wide-eyed, sensing something monumental. Otto steps in quietly, trying to de-escalate, but Dietrich's fury burns too hot. "You've forgotten who we are!" he shouts. "We are Germany, the world's finest craftsmen, the heirs of perfection." Kruger, trembling with emotion, answers, "Then perhaps perfection is what doomed us." The world doesn't bend to ideals, it rewards what endures. Miller, who's been nearby cleaning his weapon, overhears. He doesn't intervene, but later he approaches Kruger and offers something unexpected. The M1911 from the demonstration, unloaded and harmless, as a gesture of trust. "You seem like you wanted to understand," Miller says. Kruger hesitates, but accepts, feeling the weight of the metal in his hands. He studies it the way one might study a sacred text, every groove and imperfection now speaking of resilience rather than crudity. This act ignites both hope and fury. Dietrich calls it humiliation, playing student to a farmer. Kruger calls it clarity. Their rift becomes irreparable, symbolizing the broader fracture between old-world arrogance and new-world pragmatism. By the end of Part 8, Kruger's transformation solidifies. He no longer mocks, he listens. Erwin, inspired, begins sketching ideas in his notebook. Weapons that survive mud, not museums. The tone is volatile yet illuminating. Revelation through conflict. It begins before dawn. A guard's whistle pierces the air. Chaos erupts near the armory hut. Dietrich has broken in, stealing a few rounds of ammunition. His intent is not escape, it's demonstration. He demands to prove that German design still reigns supreme. Thompson and Miller arrive, weapons drawn but calm. Kruger steps forward, pleading, "Hans, don't do this. The war is over." But Dietrich doesn't hear peace, only defiance. He pulls a captured Walter P-38 from his coat. Let them see real precision. The confrontation that follows is not a gunfight, but a philosophical duel. Miller sets down his M1911 deliberately, refusing escalation. "Go on," he says quietly. "Show us." Dietrich aims at a wooden post, fires, and the weapon jams. A single click echoes like divine judgment. The silence that follows is unbearable. Kruger moves forward, picks up the M1911 from the sand, and with steady breath fires it at the same post. The bullet hits dead center. Sand settles. Even Dietrich seems frozen. Kruger doesn't gloat. He lowers the pistol, turns to his fallen comrade, and says softly, "Perfection can't survive the world. But forgiveness can." Dietrich's fury breaks into tears. Guards move in, disarming him without violence. The scene becomes a silent ritual, the surrender not of men, but of ideas. Afterward, Kruger sits outside the barracks, the pistol resting beside him. He finally understands what Miller meant, that strength isn't in flawlessness, but in resilience. He looks at Erwin and Otto, sees their quiet admiration, and feels something like peace. The tone is one of redemption and catharsis. Thompson later writes in his report, "No bullet fired today was aimed at a man, but one struck pride itself. And it did not survive. The sun in Algeria is less cruel now. Late autumn has softened its bite, turning the sand from burning gold to pale bronze. A calm wind rolls through the American camp, whistling through the wire and tin, carrying the scent of distant olive groves. The war in North Africa has long since ended, but the prisoners still live behind fences and routine. Yet something has changed, invisible but profound. The laughter that once mocked the Americans is gone. The silence now carries a strange reverence, as if the desert itself remembers the echoes of lessons learned. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Kruger wakes before dawn, as he always has. Habit, discipline, memory. They still rule his body, though his soul feels reshaped. The memory of the confrontation with Dietrich lingers, less as a wound and more as a scar that teaches. He sits by the window watching the horizon lighten. Otto is still asleep, his snores steady. Across the barracks, Erwin stirs, rubbing his eyes. The boy's sketchbook lies open on his cot, crude diagrams of the M1911 interspersed with his own design ideas, labeled Modell nach Krieg, für das Volk. A weapon for the people. Kruger smiles faintly. Once he would have scolded Erwin for such naivety. Now he feels pride of a gentler kind. At roll call, Thompson inspects the prisoners with quiet efficiency. His demeanor remains respectful but guarded. Order must still be kept. Miller, standing nearby with his pistol holstered, exchanges a knowing glance with Kruger. No words pass between them, but understanding does. A week has gone by since the incident, and the camp's daily rhythm has returned. Yet under that rhythm, a hum of change persists. After roll call, Thompson calls Kruger to his office, a small wooden structure half buried in sandbags. Inside, maps of North Africa and Europe cover the walls, red pins marking fronts already decided. Thompson gestures for Kruger to sit. "You've been keeping your men steady," Thompson says. "No fights, no arguments since Dietrich was transferred." Kruger nods. "They've begun to see things differently." Thompson leans back, curious. "Differently how?" Kruger chooses his words with care. "Once we thought strength came from perfection, precision. Now I think strength is what remains when perfection fails." Thompson studies him a long moment. "That's a fine thing to learn in a hard place." He opens a drawer and slides something across the desk, a small piece of metal wrapped in cloth. Kruger unwraps it and finds the empty shell casing from the M1911's last shot. "The one fired at the post after Dietrich's weapon jammed. Thought you might appreciate it," Thompson says. Kruger turns the casing over in his palm. "It's warm from memory, heavy with meaning." "You kept this?" "Some things are worth remembering," Thompson replies, "and some men are worth reminding." Back in the barracks, Kruger calls Otto and Erwin together. He places the casing on the table. "Tell me," he asks Otto, "what does this mean to you now?" Otto squints at it, running a calloused thumb along the edge. "It means the weapon did what it was meant to do. It fired when needed. And to you." Kruger asks Erwin. Erwin hesitates. "It means something built simple can still be strong," Kruger nods. "Yes, and it means we must decide what we will build when this war ends." He looks around at the others, who have gathered quietly. Men who once mocked now listen. "We are engineers, soldiers, thinkers. We worship the ideal, but the ideal failed us. The world belongs not to those who perfect it, but to those who adapt." Otto folds his arms. "You sound like Miller now," Kruger chuckles. "Perhaps wisdom wears many uniforms." He lifts the casing. This This is not humiliation. It's freedom. To admit something is better, not because it shames us, but because it teaches us. The men are silent, each digesting the thought. Ovin, ever curious, asks, "Do you think Germany will learn this too?" Kruger sighs. "Only if men like us bring the lesson home." Later that week, Miller invites Kruger and Otto to the firing range again, this time under Captain Thompson's supervision. It's not an official demonstration, just a gesture. The air between them is easy, almost friendly. Miller hands Kruger the M1911 once more, loaded and clean. "Figured you'd want to try it again, without all the shouting this time," Miller says with a grin. Kruger accepts the weapon reverently. He checks the slide, the magazine, the sights, not as a skeptic now, but as a student honoring a teacher. He fires once. The sound cracks across the range. The bullet hits near center. Miller nods approvingly. Not bad for a German officer. Kruger reloads and fires again, this time faster. The grouping tightens. Otto watches, smiling faintly. When the last round is spent, Kruger lowers the weapon slowly. "It's not the machine," he says quietly. "It's the philosophy behind it." Miller holsters his pistol and leans against a post. "You know, back home we've got a saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Maybe that's what makes this old girl special. She doesn't try to be perfect, she just tries to work." Kruger looks down at his hands. "Then perhaps perfection is not the goal. Endurance is." For the first time, Miller extends his hand. Kruger shakes it firmly. Two soldiers from opposing worlds, united by understanding. Days turn into weeks. Word spreads through the camp that Germany is collapsing. The Allies have crossed into Italy. Prisoners speak in hushed tones, wondering what remains of their homeland. Some feel despair. Others, quiet relief. Kruger writes letters in those days, though he has no idea if they'll ever reach Munich. In one, addressed to his father, he writes, "You taught me to respect the machine as the measure of man's genius. But I have learned that the truest measure is how a machine serves, even in failure. I saw a pistol that should not have worked, too heavy, too crude, yet it never failed. Perhaps I have been wrong all my life. Perhaps we all have." He pauses, pen hovering, then adds, "When I return, I will not rebuild our pride. I will rebuild our humility." One evening, as the camp settles into twilight, Kruger walks the perimeter fence. The guards no longer watch him warily. His demeanor commands respect, not suspicion. He finds Miller sitting by the gate, polishing his sidearm. "Still keeping her clean," Kruger says, smiling. "Habit," Miller replies. "A man trusts what he maintains." They sit together, watching the sun melt into the dunes. The conversation drifts. Talk of Kansas wheat fields, of Bavarian winters, of what they'll do when this is over. Both men realize something profound. The world they return to will never be the same, and maybe that's a good thing. "Do you think men can change?" Kruger asks. Miller nods. "If they can admit they need to." Kruger looks toward the horizon. "Then maybe this war wasn't for nothing." The moment stretches, quiet, mutual, eternal. Months later, the camp receives orders for transfer. Some prisoners will be moved to the United States for labor. Others, like Kruger, will remain until final repatriation. Before departure, Thompson gathers the senior officers, Kruger among them, for a short address. "The war will end soon," Thompson says. "You'll go home. What you take from this place, that's up to you. But remember, empires fall, nations change. The ideas that survive are the ones that adapt." He pauses, then looks directly at Kruger. "You understand that better than most." After the meeting, Kruger lingers by the door. "Captain," he says, "thank you, not for kindness, but for clarity." Thompson smiles faintly. "Clarity's the first step toward peace." When the war finally ends, Kruger returns to a broken Germany. The cities lie in ruins, the factories silent. But amidst the rubble he sees possibility. Otto finds work repairing machinery. Erwin studies engineering at a new technical school. Kruger, too, finds his purpose, consulting for civilian industries, preaching a new gospel of design, simplicity, reliability, and endurance. In 1948, he visits a small workshop in Stuttgart. On the table lies a prototype pistol, inspired by his sketches and Irwin's notes. It bears a simple engraving on the side, für das Leben, not der Krieg, for life, not for war. Kruger holds it carefully, running his hand over the frame. "We have learned," he whispers. Years later, an aging Kruger receives a parcel from America. Inside is a letter and a worn leather holster. The note reads, "Wilhelm, found this in an old trunk when I retired. Figured it belongs with someone who understands her story. Jack Dusty Miller, Kansas, USA." Kruger takes the holster in his hands, still faintly smelling of oil and dust. He places it beside the brass casing on his desk. Through the window, the sun catches both objects, turning them gold. He smiles softly and whispers in English, the language of his former enemy. "Not perfect." Just right, June 2nd, 1943. The morning air in central Algeria was crisp, a cool reprieve from the desert's usual blaze. The POW transfer convoy wound its way toward a larger camp near the coast. Inside one of the canvas-covered trucks sat Oberleutnant Wilhelm Kruger, his eyes following the endless horizon. His uniform, though faded, remained meticulously pressed, a remnant of the pride that once defined him. Yet something had shifted. Where arrogance once held his posture rigid, now there was calm purpose. Across from him sat Feldwebel Otto Reiner, quietly whittling a piece of scrapwood into the vague shape of a pistol grip. It was his habit to keep his hands busy, and the small shavings scattered on the truck's wooden floor like dust in sunlight. Beside them, young Corporal Erwin Schulte leaned forward, his eyes wide as he spoke softly. "Do you think we'll see them again, Herr Oberleutnant?" "Sergeant Miller, Captain Thompson?" Kruger's lips curved into something almost like a smile. "If the war allows it, perhaps. But some men you do not need to meet again to remember them." The truck rattled along the uneven road, the sound of loose metal and diesel engines creating a steady rhythm. Kruger's thoughts drifted, not to the battles he had fought, nor the victories once glorified by Berlin's propaganda reels, but to that singular day at the firing range. The sight of Miller's steady hands, the M1911 spitting fire in the hot wind, the simplicity that mocked his lifelong reverence for precision. He could still hear the words, calm and unpretentious, "It's not meant to impress, it's meant to work." The phrase had carved itself deep within him, reshaping how he saw not only machines, but men. The convoy halted at midday in a small refueling post, little more than a few tents and a water pump surrounded by rocky hills. The prisoners were allowed to stretch their legs under watchful American eyes. A handful of guards shared cigarettes, and one of them, broad-shouldered, easy-going, looked faintly familiar. When he turned, Kruger recognized the gait, the dust-stained hat tilted low. Sergeant Jack Dusty Miller. Miller caught his gaze and grinned. "Well, if it ain't the professor of pistols himself." Kruger laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even him. "Sergeant Miller, I see they haven't managed to get rid of you yet." "Not for lack of trying," Miller said, lighting another cigarette and offering one to Kruger. The German hesitated, then accepted. They smoked in companionable silence for a while, two soldiers momentarily free of flags. "You heading east?" Miller asked at last. "Transfer to the coastal facility." "They say it's more permanent," Kruger replied. Miller nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's as close to peace as we get in times like these." Kruger studied the man, the relaxed ease, the quiet confidence, the way he carried no visible hatred. "Tell me, Sergeant," he began slowly, "when you hold that pistol of yours, do you think of it as a weapon or as a tool?" Miller smiled, squinting into the sun. "Both. Depends what the day asks of me. A tool when it needs to fix a bad situation, a weapon when it needs to stop a worse one. Either way, it's made to do the job, not to look good doing it." Kruger nodded, the words sinking in deeper than before. "Perhaps men should be built the same way," Miller chuckled. "If you figure out how, let me know." They parted with a firm handshake. No ceremony, no speeches, just mutual respect forged in dust and humility. That night in the new camp near Algiers, Kruger sat on the edge of his cot with a small notebook in hand. The barracks around him buzzed with subdued chatter. men trading rumors, complaints, and hopes of early repatriation. Otto sat nearby, repairing a broken canteen strap, while Schulte wrote letters by candlelight. Kruger dipped his pen in ink and began to write, not as an officer, but as a man seeking to understand. June 2nd, 1943. I once believed strength was born from perfection, from the flawless line of a Luger's barrel, the seamless fit of a machine's parts, the rigid precision of order and hierarchy. Today, I understand that endurance is the true mark of mastery. The M1911, how strange that such a crude thing could teach me grace. It was not beauty that made it worthy, but purpose. It worked because it did not care for appearances. I think perhaps the same can be said of the nation that made it. He paused, staring at the ink drying across the paper. The candle flickered, and for a moment his reflection trembled in the small tin mirror by his bunk. And what of us? The proud engineers, the heirs of the machine age, have we built our pride too fine, too fragile to survive the world's dust? He closed the notebook, the thought lingering like a prayer. Across the room, Schulte spoke quietly. Herr Oberleutnant, do you still think Germany is superior? Kruger looked at the young man, his expression soft but steady. Superior? No, capable, yes. But I no longer think superiority means much. What matters is endurance. A people's ability to adapt, to learn, to work even when the gears grind with sand. Schulte nodded slowly. Then maybe one day we can build again. Better. Kruger's gaze drifted toward the small, slit window where the stars stretched endlessly across the Algerian night. Yes, he said quietly, but only if we remember what broke us. Weeks passed. Routine settled in. The prisoners labored during the day, building storage sheds and maintaining supply depots. Occasionally, Kruger would overhear American soldiers discussing the war in Europe, the fall of Sicily, the bombing of Hamburg. The news struck deep, yet he met it with calm acceptance. The old Kruger would have raged, cursed the incompetence of others. Now he simply took it as truth, a world shifting beyond his control. One evening, Captain Thompson visited the barracks. He carried a small box under one arm. Oberleutnant Kruger, he said, Sergeant Miller asked me to give you this before he shipped out. Kruger stood, taking the box carefully. Inside lay an empty M1911 magazine, polished, unused, and a single folded note. For when you need to remember that simplicity sometimes wins wars. Dusty, Kruger closed the box, emotion tightening his chest. Tell him, he said softly, that his lesson was well received. Thompson nodded. He already knows. When the captain left, Kruger placed the magazine on his table beside his journal. He touched it once, as if to test its reality. The metal was cool against his fingertips, industrial, unremarkable, enduring. It felt less like a weapon and more like a symbol of something quietly indestructible. That night, before sleep, Kruger wrote one last entry. True strength is not born of precision, but of purpose. The Luger may win admiration, but the Colt wins survival. A nation that builds for the man, rather than for the myth, will always outlast one that worships its own perfection. Perhaps that is the lesson this war was meant to teach me. He blew out the candle. The desert wind whispered through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it a faint scent of oil and dust. The kind that lingered long after the smoke of war faded, and in that quiet darkness, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Kruger, once the embodiment of German pride, finally understood what it meant to endure. The letter arrived in Munich in the spring of 1947, stamped with the insignia of the United States Army. The war had been over for 2 years, yet its ghosts still lingered in the cracks of Europe, in the rubble, the ration lines, the eyes of widows. When Oberleutnant Wilhelm Kruger's wife, Elise, opened the envelope, she half expected it to be another bureaucratic formality about her husband's repatriation. Instead, she found a letter written in careful foreign English. At the bottom was a signature she could barely read, Sergeant Jack Dusty Miller. The letter was addressed not only to her, but to the memory of a man Miller had never truly hated. Inside, Miller wrote of the camp in Algeria, The demonstration, the storm, the quiet dignity of Kruger's final days before transfer. He described how the German officer had changed, how pride had bent into humility, and how he had once said, "Simplicity is not the absence of greatness. It is what remains when all else is stripped away." Miller ended the letter simply. He learned what we all must learn, that strength is not in the weapon, but in the will to see truth, even when it humbles us. Elise read the letter 3 times before she folded it, her hands trembling. For the first time since hearing of her husband's captivity, she allowed herself to weep, not for his defeat, but for his peace. Outside, the city was rebuilding. Cranes rose where ruins had been, and children's laughter began to fill the air once more. Life, fragile yet persistent, moved forward. In Kansas, Jack Miller stood on the porch of his family farm, the same fields where he had learned to shoot tin cans off fence posts before the war. The sun dipped low, setting the wheat alight in golden hues. He leaned against the wooden railing, the Colt M1911 resting on the table beside him. It was old now, the bluing worn smooth, the grip panels faded. But it still worked perfectly. He had cleaned it that morning, a ritual he never abandoned. Though the pistol hadn't been fired since Algeria, he sometimes thought about Kruger, his posture, his pride, and that look in his eyes during the final days. There had been something in that gaze, something Miller hadn't understood until long after the war: recognition. 2 soldiers, enemies by circumstance, united by the same stubborn devotion to craft, to meaning, to understanding what truly mattered. Miller wondered if Kruger had ever made it home. The letter he'd sent had gone unanswered, but perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Some messages were meant not to be returned, only to be heard. He picked up the Colt, turned it in his hand, and smiled. "Still with me, old girl," he said softly. Then he holstered it, as though tucking away not just a weapon, but a memory of sand, of smoke, of the day. 2 philosophies collided and found something human between them. Meanwhile, in a small workshop outside Hamburg, Otto Reiner ran his hands over a new project, a broken radio he'd been asked to repair. He had opened a small shop after the war, fixing what others thought beyond saving. The air smelled of solder and oil, familiar and grounding. On a shelf above his workbench sat a photograph. 6 men standing in the desert, uniforms wrinkled, eyes wary. One of them, Wilhelm Kruger, stood at the center, his expression unreadable. Otto sometimes spoke to the photograph when no one was listening. "You'd have liked this, Wilhelm," he murmured, as he tinkered with a set of wires. "Machines that endure, not for glory, but because they must." A small smile touched his lips. The radio crackled to life, a faint melody filling the shop. A jazz tune, American, something lively and defiant. Otto paused, listening. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same music once labeled as decadent was now part of the world's heartbeat. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not conquest, but continuity. Years later, long after the uniforms had faded and the flags had changed, Corporal Erwin Schulte stood in a museum in Berlin. He was older now, with white in his hair and lines etched deep across his face. He moved slowly, cane in hand, pausing before a glass case labeled Weapons of the Second World War. Inside, arranged with almost reverent precision, were sidearms from every major nation. The Luger P08, the Walther P38, the Webley, the Tokarev, and at the far end, the Colt M1911. Erwin stared at it for a long time. Its simplicity still caught him off guard. There was nothing ornate, nothing elegant, yet something about it radiated permanence. Beneath the display card, a note read, "The M1911 served in every major American conflict for over a century. Reliable, enduring, simple." He leaned on his cane, whispering to himself, "Simple, but not small." His reflection overlapped the weapon's shape in the glass, merging past and present for a fleeting second. In that moment, he saw not enemies or victors, but men, each trying to understand what made their world endure. A young boy beside him tugged at his father's sleeve. "Papa," the child asked, "why did the Americans make it so heavy?" The father chuckled. Because sometimes, he said, the world needs something that doesn't break when it should. Irwin smiled faintly, eyes glistening. He turned away from the case, the sound of the child's laughter following him down the corridor. As the years passed, the world changed again. Nations rebuilt, ideologies softened, and the desert that once held prisoners now bloomed with settlements and trade. Time, ever patient, eroded both pride and pain, leaving behind the fragments of lessons learned too late. Among them, the story of the Colt and the captured officers became one of those quiet tales passed among historians. Small, almost forgotten but whispered with reverence, and somewhere, perhaps in another dusty range in another age, a young soldier would lift a pistol, feel its solid weight, and understand, without knowing why, that simplicity carries its own kind of truth. The world no longer remembered the names of every man who had stood in that North African camp, but it remembered what they had learned, that humility is not surrender, and that endurance in the end is the truest mark of greatness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.